I mean, the contrast between the reports we've seen on your programme this morning, the images that we have seen in the newspapers of military personnel carrying children to safety. We know that British diplomatic staff are literally handwriting visa applications on the tarmac at Kabul airport. They're answering the call, but the Foreign Secretary, and now it transpires, his deputy, couldn't even be bothered to make a call because he was on holiday. I think that is unconscionable and unforgivable. This debate around what difference it may or may not have made, well, it's all speculative now because it didn't happen. It certainly wouldn't have done any harm. And for the Foreign Secretary to be missing in action during this crisis, I think is unforgivable, and I think his position is untenable.
But the argument being made, not necessarily about why he personally wouldn't make the phone call, but of course the argument being made generally is that everyone from the UK to the United States and other NATO allies were blindsided by the speed in which this happened and the speed in which Kabul fell.
What has the Foreign Secretary been doing for the last 18 months? After Doha and the withdrawal that was announced, we knew that this day was coming. The UK chairs the G7. It's a leading member of NATO. It has a UN Security Council seat. Those are all within the job remit of the Foreign Secretary to use whatever levers he can. I'll give you an example of this. In April, the government set up a scheme to help Afghans who had worked with the British to apply for refugee status. There are 7,000 of those people, but only 2,000 have been processed. And that's why we're seeing the chaotic scenes at Kabul airport. And when the government itself says that not everyone will get out, that is an admission of failure of strategy over the last 18 months. And now, of course, it's being left to those on the ground doing their very best, working really hard, from military personnel through to diplomatic staff, to try and do what they can operationally to mitigate the disaster that has been a complete absence of any strategy to prepare for this day over the last 18 months.
I mean, what would you like to see happen now? Because, look, the reality is, and whatever political points you either want to or need to be made with this, we are where we are, and we're talking about people's lives here. So it's about looking forward now, isn't it, in the immediate term? So what do you want to see happen now?
Well, that's absolutely the priority, to get British nationals to safety and then others as we can. That has got to be the focus of everyone. And again, I commend and pay tribute to those working so hard on the ground to make that happen. There are concerns, I think, about the access to the airport. I think there are worries as well about not the UK, I understand, but some other countries where planes have been leaving that are virtually empty. So there needs to be now a diplomatic effort to ensure that we, working with our allies, do as much as we can over the coming days. But then in a further and in a wider context, we need to, and we have a duty to, as Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, said in the Commons this week, to see that our friends are all right. We can't abandon these people. We can't abandon those who worked with us and for us in Afghanistan. We can't abandon the women in prominent positions in public life there, the judges, the members of the Afghan parliament. We need to have a full and comprehensive security assessment about the consequences of the collapse of the Afghan government and its system and the Taliban taking power, and what impact that will have on us here in the UK. Those are all things that need to happen urgently. And Britain, given its position in the world, should be leading those efforts. It's not good enough to criticise the US administration. It's not good enough for the Foreign Secretary to say, not me, Gov, not my responsibility. The Prime Minister himself should now intervene. He should corral all of our allies through NATO, working through the UN Security Council and in the chairmanship of the G7 to get an international agreement about what we're going to do in terms of refugees and how we're going to approach the government that is taking power in Afghanistan.
I mean, you talk about not abandoning our friends, but what do we actually do? Even if we got out all the people that you talked about, what do we then do in dealing with Afghanistan? Do we deal with the Taliban on a proper diplomatic way? Do we try to assert any political force on them? Do we maintain an armed presence there? I mean, ideally, what would you like to see?
Look, I think the first thing to say is that these are all questions that we've known were going to have to be answered for the last 18 months. And it seems that not only have the UK government, but the international community has failed to address any of them. I think in terms of what the Taliban does, we will have to judge them by their actions clearly over the next number of days. There is a practical element to ensuring that we get as many people out as possible. And if the Taliban are surrounding the airport, then there will need to be some engagement with them at ground level, as our military commanders there have already said is taking place, to ensure that we can do that as quickly as possible. But then I think we and the West needs to regroup and needs to focus and needs to look very carefully at the strategy towards Afghanistan, and it needs to be a united approach. We need to ensure that organisations like the International Monetary Fund play its part in terms of it having the Afghan reserves. And I think we also need to look at aid, about where that goes and about how that is deployed. We, of course, have to avoid any further humanitarian catastrophe and crisis and any addition to the awful, heartbreaking scenes that we've seen. But we can't allow the Taliban, having seized some of the levers of power that it has already, to be given any cover by the international community until we've been able to make a full and proper assessment of just what this new regime is doing.